Welcome back to Face the Nation and our annual CBS News Correspondents Year-End Roundtable. It's now in its 69th year, which means it's even older than Face the Nation itself. The tradition started in the very early days of television news. Joining me today to continue it for 2019 are our beat reporters based here in the Washington Bureau. David Martin covers national security. You usually see him at the Pentagon. Jan Crawford covers the Supreme Court and keeps us straight on all legal issues. Jeff Pegues covers the Justice Department and Homeland Security. Nancy Cordes has been very busy up on Capitol Hill covering Congress. Paula Reid is our go-to when it comes to all things particularly legal with the president. She's now full-time at the White House. And Major Garrett was formerly chief White House correspondent, and he now covers just about everything in Washington as our chief correspondent in this town. Thank you all for being here. Nancy, you've had an incredibly busy end of year. And we may start 2020 with a trial, or will we? Will President Trump face a trial in the Senate? And what does it look like?
Act 1 is over. Act 2 is just beginning. We will definitely see a trial. I think it will happen in January. You know, Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell have done this dance so often, they could do it with their eyes closed. It's just that now they're fighting over impeachment. They're staking out their positions early. She says she wants to know what this trial is going to look like, whether there will be witnesses before she sends the articles of impeachment over. He says he doesn't have to listen to what she has to say.
So, Major, we begin and end the year with impeachment. What will the president do here? Because he chose not to participate in the House case. If it goes to a trial, what is he going to do?
So he's going to take a lot of advice, and he has offered conflicting messages about what he wants. At times saying, I want a full-blown trial, I want lots of witnesses. Meanwhile, Senate Republicans are saying, look, if the Senate's prepared to acquit you, Mr. President, take the acquittal and go. The most likely outcome, I think, is, and the president will, I think, move over time toward this, something that looked a little bit like the Clinton impeachment trial. A presentation of the charges, questions from the senators, and then possibly a motion to dismiss. And if 51 Republican senators agree to that and talk the president into it, that could be the sum total of this process.
Chief Justice Roberts will be presiding over this trial when and if it begins in the new year. So, Jen, what do we need to know about how he's going to try to run this?
Well, I mean, the Chief Justice, I think, is going to go in there with one goal, and that is to not be the story. I think he's going to really take a page from his predecessor and how he ran the trial of President Clinton, the late Chief Justice William Rehnquist, and just not be the story. I think what's interesting for the chief and for the court in general is that as he is presiding over that trial, across the street at the Supreme Court, the justices are in the middle of what is probably the biggest term in recent memory.
It's going to be significant. I know, Paula, for the State Department and for the Secretary of State, this was an incredible, unexpected focus for impeachment that thrust these people who like to be on the sidelines working on policy right into a pretty harsh spotlight. Secretary Pompeo said he would be willing to testify and present evidence as required by law. He seems pretty confident he's not actually going to have to do that.
His confidence,
is it a safe bet?
It's a pretty safe bet that the White House will not ask him to testify. And this question right now of what you do if you are subpoenaed by Congress and the White House tells you can't cooperate, it's currently being litigated. And different officials have different views on this. Right now, former National Security Advisor John Bolton, he and his deputy, they're litigating this. They've asked the courts to decide if they have to cooperate.
I think, of Rudy Giuliani and his ongoing legal troubles. If there is new evidence, information that comes out due to a trial, due to some kind of court proceeding on the outside, what does it do to what happens inside the Capitol and the trial to come?
Giuliani is a wild card here. I mean, he is still traveling to Ukraine, talking to former prosecutors, claiming that he's got more evidence about Joe Biden and the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and all the rest, something that Republicans dearly wish he would stop doing. So, and the president continues to praise him and egg him on. So, that is a problem for the president. But at this point, we don't see any signs of the Republican wall of support for him cracking.
Because Giuliani has said he would be willing to participate in the Senate trial, but he is alone in thinking that that is a good idea, mostly because he is currently under investigation by the Trump Justice Department. And there's no one in the West Wing except for the president who has ever suggested to me that they believe he is helping his defense at this time. So the president, as you noted, he believes that he brings gravitas to his case. He still sees him as he was in 9/11. It's unclear if the president would support his participation.
This is all the politics of it, but this came from the national security world, this concern. It all comes back to anti-tank Javelin missiles, Russia's annexation of Crimea, and intervention in Ukraine. All of this is the backdrop to what led to the withholding of military aid and the political standoff. What is the bottom line here in terms of if Vladimir Putin is emboldened? Does the Pentagon have concern that all this public posturing has hurt their position?
There's politically emboldened, and how can he not be politically emboldened when you have so many elected officials in the United States parroting his talking points? But I and the military and the Pentagon all look at this through more nuts and bolts eyes, and what we see is that ever since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the U.S. military has doubled down on its plans and its training for reinforcing Europe. Last year, I went on to an exercise in Norway, which was the biggest since the end of the Cold War. Next year, the Army is going to put more troops into Germany than it has in this century. So the U.S. military, despite all the bad-mouthing of NATO, the U.S. military is continuing to concentrate on the defense of Europe.
Jeff Pegues, on that Russian interest front, tell me about election security going into 2020. Will Russia try to replicate what they did in 2016?
Well, I think that's what U.S. officials are anticipating, but having covered this issue, it's hard to believe that when a criminal breaks into a house, he's going to use the same tactic the next time. And so that is the challenge here, is trying to harden the systems that were weak in 2016. But then how do you try to anticipate what the Russians might try to do next? Every time we see any type of cyber attack, the tactics evolve. And so there remains a vulnerability there.
Yeah, the U.S. intelligence assessment said not just Russia, but China, Iran,
Oh, exactly.
all things to watch and worry about in terms of election security. But I'd like for both you and Paula to weigh in on the other big probe that we don't yet know the results of, and that is what's called the Durham investigation. This is all about the Attorney General, and Jan, you may know a bit about this as well, given your past interviews with him. What is it that we can expect the Attorney General to reveal about the origins of the Mueller investigation, the probe of the probe? Is this going to be what President Trump is looking for?
I think it is. Even if, as my sources tell me, it's unlikely that anyone will be criminally charged. This is no longer just a review. This is a criminal investigation being conducted by the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut. I don't expect anyone will be charged, but the president doesn't necessarily need anyone to be charged, because if this is released next year during the 2020 campaign, it's an opportunity for the president to revisit everything that we just heard in the Inspector General's report about the mistakes that were made.
You know, this is a highly respected prosecutor, both sides of the aisle. So I think the report will have quite a bit of currency when he comes out with it. The Attorney General made clear, and has consistently made clear, there was spying on the Trump campaign. He doesn't understand that word to be pejorative. It is what it is. I mean, there was. What was the grounds for that? Was there justification? It's as Paula indicated, it's a very broad charge that he has, and clearly the Attorney General believes there's good reason for it.
David Martin, the Trump administration is staring down an end-of-year deadline of sorts set by Kim Jong-un of North Korea, saying that diplomacy expires, and they are preparing for the test of a satellite, a long-range ICBM. What this does is it basically throws into question President Trump's centerpiece foreign policy issue and thrusts us pretty close to crisis, not just in an election year, but at a pretty critical time for North Korea's nuclear program. How much stronger are they now? How much bigger is the threat?
Well, it's been more than 2 years since they tested a long-range missile that could reach the United States. But you can be sure Kim Jong-un's rocket scientists haven't been sitting around popping bonbons for the past 2 years. They've been hard at work trying to develop a better, more reliable, more accurate missile. And we will know how much progress they've made when we start seeing their tests. And if they have developed a missile that doesn't just have the theoretical range of reaching the United States, but has a no-kidding military capability to drop a nuclear warhead on us, then we are in a situation we have never been in before. 2019 in North Korea is going to be remembered as the year the music died. And the music being this fantasia that Kim Jong-un would give up his nuclear weapons and the U.S. and North Korea would live happily ever after.
And it thrusts us into 2020 politics. And we're back now with our CBS News Correspondents Panel. Jan, you mentioned a really busy year on the court. One of the things that will be ruled on is what to do with these so-called dreamers, the DACA program. What can we expect? When will that happen?
Well, that's the case about President Trump's efforts to rescind that Dreamers program that President Obama put into place with the sign of a pen by executive action.
And it affects hundreds of thousands of people.
I would not be surprised if the president loses that case. But this is a court in transition. In the olden days, and I've covered the court a long time, you could get a pretty good feel for the way the court was going to decide a case based on how they asked the questions at argument. A lot of the questions were designed to get the vote of Justice Kennedy. So the justices would generally tip their hands because they'd be really going after the side that they disagreed with during oral argument. Now, they ask questions of both sides. It's a very different feel at argument, which makes this court very difficult to predict. So I think, any time that you see someone saying it looks like the court's going to rule this way, take that with a grain of salt.
But we can expect this before the election.
All of these cases will come down, most of the controversial cases come down by the end of the term in June, right in the middle of the presidential election. So you're going to get the Supreme Court weighing in on DACA, abortion rights, gay rights, gun rights potentially, the president's tax returns. I mean, these are all, any given year, one of these cases would be landmark, blockbuster term.
And that red meat lands right in the middle of election season.
And it will make the future of the court a central issue of the 2020 campaign.
I want to go around the table. Paula, can you start us off, though? Undercovered story in your beat and story you wish you could have covered.
Oh, a story I wish I could have covered, Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, that case had everything, and I'd watch our colleagues in New York covering that, and I'd always say, my God, this trial has everything. This would have been the trial of a lifetime. And in terms of undercovered story, I'd say the same thing I said last year, which is the opioid epidemic across the country, how that continues to impact lives.
Nancy?
Undercovered story on my beat, anything but impeachment. I mean, Congress just passed a $1.4 trillion spending package, all kinds of goodies stuffed in there, got very little coverage. Big trade deal, very little coverage compared to impeachment. Gun policy. We thought there was a huge breakthrough after El Paso and Dayton. The president came out, said that he was for red flag laws and he was for perhaps strengthening background checks, that the White House would be issuing some kind of proposal. We haven't seen anything. We haven't seen anything from the White House. We haven't seen a single hearing in the Senate. Nobody talks about it anymore. Story I wish I'd covered. Well, Paula got to interview Elmo and Big Bird at the Kennedy Center on it.
I was jealous of that,
and that was
too.
pretty cool. I would have gotten a lot of street cred with my kids if I had done that.
Exactly. What about you, Jeff?
I think these ransomware attacks on these cities across the country, it is costing tens of millions of dollars to these cities, and it's still sort of flying under the radar. And ultimately, that is a cost that will be passed on to taxpayers.
Jan?
So I think the underreported story on my beat is President Trump's transformation of the federal judiciary. I mean, we talk about the 2 Supreme Court justices, but he's appointed a quarter of the federal appeals court bench now, 50. 133 or more at this point, federal district court judges. Those judges are appointed for life. It's the president's most lasting legacy. They will be on the bench deciding issues of enormous importance to everyday life for generations. The story I wish that I had covered, I would say the women's basketball Final Four, college basketball. It's a great event. I'm a big women's basketball fan, incredible athletes and competition, and I wish I had covered that because that would suggest that we covered women's sports more.
Good point. David?
Well, at the risk of boring people, it's the withdrawal.
No, now you have to be cheery. You're scaring us, David.
The withdrawal of the United States from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces deal with Russia.
The INF Treaty.
The INF Treaty. And it doesn't have much to do with Russia. It has to do with China, because China was not covered by that treaty. And so China had been developing these missiles for years and years. And now the U.S. can start developing those missiles, and it's already conducted 2 tests. And what's at issue here is the buildup on those islands in the South China Sea. China has been making these military bases all around the South China Sea. Once the U.S. has an intermediate range land-based missile, it will be able to threaten every single one of those built-up islands in the South China Sea. The arms race with China is on, and in many cases, like these missiles, we're playing catch-up with China.
And that is, I would say, underreported, undercovered, and also back in your scary bucket, David, because there is so much, particularly on the diplomatic front, that is causing concern with China right now.
The story I wish.
What did you wish?
I wish I had been there when they got Baghdadi.
That's
a good one.
That man was evil. And to have been there when he was brought to justice, I think would have been a great experience. Plus, I would have been able to report whether or not he screamed and cried in his final moments, as the president said he did.
undercovered and wish you'd covered.
Right. So sometimes undercovered stories are complicated, and this one, I think, falls resolutely in that category. The president's relationship to people of color in this country. His rhetoric is indefensible even by many Republicans. Charlottesville, send her back this year, is what people hear and think about when they think about the president and people of color. And yet, it can be fairly said that this administration, because of President Trump's quiet prodding, has done quite a bit for funding of historically black colleges and universities. The First Step Act, which was a massive first step toward criminal justice reform. Just a couple of weeks ago, in this newly signed defense bill, there is a law that says if you are seeking work for the federal government or any contractor, you don't have to be asked, and you cannot be asked about your criminal history until right toward the end. That's a significant change, long sought by criminal justice advocates. Plus opportunity zones in the tax bill directed at communities of color. That is a legacy on the agenda side that almost any president after 3 years would want to claim, particularly President Obama. Many of those things were sought, but you know what? Republicans would not go for it. Quietly, persistently, President Trump has pushed Republicans in this direction, and I think that's an undercovered story. What did I wish I covered this year? Anytime I see our brilliant colleague Mark Phillips in the water covering an environmental story, that's where I want to be.
All right, Major Garrett, on the climate beat, what is your prediction for the new year?
It's safe, but it's important that election turnout in November of 2020 will be the highest it's been in a century. It could near or possibly exceed 70%.
David Martin, you have an incredible track record in your predictions, although I do have to say there's kind of a 2-year delay. Often. You predicted talks directly between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. 2 years later, it happened. You predicted the demise of al-Baghdadi, who you just talked about. 2 years later, it happened. So what's the prediction for 2021?
So 2020 is shaping up to be the year of maximum danger. We've got these 2 ticking bombs out there, Iran and North Korea. We've got a president, a commander-in-chief, running for re-election under the shadow of impeachment. But I'm going to draw back from the brink. I'm going to predict that we have an incident which serves as a wake-up call for our vulnerability in space. We are going to lose the services of some vital satellite, maybe, say, the global positioning satellites that runs all our lives. It will just be temporary. But the worst part about it will be we won't know whether it was a technical malfunction, an accident, or an attack by a foreign power.
Because of our cyber vulnerabilities.
Because of the amount of effort that Russia and China have been putting into anti-satellite weapons ever since they witnessed what we could do with space in the Gulf War of 1990. That's how long they've been working on this. And they know that our military and now our economy just depends on those satellites up in space. If you're going to strike America in its center of gravity, that's where it is.
Jan Crawford, bring us back from the brink.
Tough act to follow.
Yeah, I mean, it's like today's version of the space race. Yeah. If I go back to my beat, my prediction would be that the Supreme Court's not going to make anybody happy this year. I don't think that it's going to be a court that is uniformly conservative with rulings for President Trump, or one that's going to be uniformly, surprisingly positive for liberals. I think they'll split the difference, and as a result, it'll give everybody something to complain about.
Jeff.
Okay, so I'm going to predict something that has a little bit to do with my beat, and the rest is off the beat. So I think the Baltimore Ravens are going to win the Super Bowl. That is a town with a lot of grit, a town that never gives up. And I just think, given all that has happened there, they have the momentum, and I think they're going to win the Super Bowl.
All right. We'll let you check that off as a Jeff prediction.
Okay.
Nancy?
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb, predict that Democrats will retain control of the House. Republicans will retain control of the Senate, though the margins in both will shrink. And I think that while the impeachment inquiry in the House is over, the investigations of this president are not going to stop. They've won some early court battles. They'll win some more, I predict, in 2020. And so we could get a very fascinating glimpse for the first time at not only possibly the president's tax returns, but also his personal and business finances.
Paula.
I predict that the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, will be charged by the Justice Department. We know that they are currently reviewing his finances. It's not that hard to run afoul of foreign lobbying requirements. And Giuliani has told me he denies that he's broken any laws. But he also tells me that Bill Barr would never charge me. But that completely flies in the face of what Bill Barr has said publicly. I cannot speak to whether he would actually be convicted, because while it is easy to run afoul of these laws, it is tough to get a conviction. But there are a lot of questions about where he's getting his money. And you have two of his close associates who have been charged, who have an incentive to cooperate. And we have learned that they've received hundreds of thousands, millions in some cases, of dollars from folks with ties to oligarchs in Ukraine
and the Russian mob.
Exactly, and the Russian mob. Doesn't look good.
Thank you, Paula.